Yes. So welcome, William. Thank you very much for coming again.
Thank you.
Today we are going to divert from the war on the family, and we are going to talk about objective truth, which I think is very important topic, and people need to realize how dangerous it is when you fall to relativism and all these postmodernist agendas. So maybe William, you can uh, what is that? Maybe you can take us away and first tell us why it's even important to talk about it and what brought you to write a book about that.
Sure, my pleasure. Okay, so I guess the origin of the book was a cocktail party. Excuse me. I walk in the room. There's a lot of people there that I don't know. And I see one gentleman who looks like a nice fellow. And I thought I'll go strike up a conversation with him. So I walk over to him and we start chatting, et cetera, et cetera. And at one point or another, I say something that I think is indubitable, cannot be debated. It's just an eternal truth. And he looks at me and he says, well, it's true for you, but it's not true for me. And this was my moment when I say, well, it can't be true and false at the same time. One of us must be wrong. And I'm very interested to know which one it is because it could be me or him. But he's not interested in that. He walks away to drink with someone else. And right away, I see there's a problem in our society, which I think is rampant in the Western world, which is, okay, let's put it this way. I have to give you an image. My image of the moral composition of every society would be a kind of image of a big balloon over the entire society. You've seen those structures they put up over tennis courts in countries where there's bad weather anyway. They're air-supported structures, and they're over, 2, 3, 4, a dozen tennis courts. I don't know. It's like a big bubble. Well, I think every country for all time has kind of proceeded on the assumption there's a kind of moral bubble that covers everybody in the society. And we all live under this bubble. And whenever something goes wrong, we all kind of know what it is. And we all more or less agree that it's wrong or right, depending what we're talking about. But here's a guy at the cocktail party who's decided that to hell with the moral bubble covering everybody. I'm going to go forth in my own bubble. I've got my own private moral bubble, and you've got yours. And if we bump into each other, or there's some kind of morality problem, let's say, truth problem, one of us may have to apologize and move on, but it's not a big deal, compared to when you're all living in the same moral bubble where it can cause havoc. And so I began to see that the general moral bubble in society has been dissolved over time. It no longer really exists except in the minds of some people, but not in the minds of everyone like it used to. In fact, I'll just share with you that, let me back up. We'll get to that. How it came to be that we blew up the general moral bubble, and now we're all walking around in a private moral bubble. To do that, maybe I should just say that this seems serious enough to me that I said to myself, everyone's believing what that guy at the cocktail party said. True for you, but not true for me. But I don't think that's true. So I thought someone's got to write a book about the problem of relativism in society at large. And I decided after looking at a lot of the literature that was going to have to be me, because even though lots of other people have written on this topic, I couldn't find anything that was sort of wide-ranging and general enough to interest readers. So I started to do it. And I'm just going to run you through some of the things that I ran across in creating this book. First of all, I realized there's a big difference, which most people are not aware of, between relativism and what I call relationism. Let me give you an example. Um, you're sitting in a railway station, you're sitting in your railway car, and suddenly you start to move, or you think you start to move, but you're not sure. It could be the rail car beside you that's moving and not you. Now, everyone's had that experience. It's extremely unsettling for most of us. In fact, we panic a little bit. Oh my God, am I moving, or is that car moving? The only way you can tell is if you can find a third reference point. For example, through the window of the moving car, or maybe your car, you see the platform. And the moment you see the platform, your logic says the platform can't be moving. So, and I'm still seeing it just like it is. So it must be the other car that's moving. And suddenly you relax because you feel the world is the way it should be. And now you know what's actually happening. Well, that's the case of relationism, where the relation between the two moving cars and the platform is uncertain at the moment. But what you know the moment you figure it out is that it's not uncertain at all. It's you who were uncertain about your reference points. And everybody in the public tends to confuse these type of things. Experience is what they say to themselves is, you see, everything is relative. The only way I could figure it out was through believing in relativism, but it's not the case. It just as when you say to someone, I want to meet you at the so-and-so office tower downtown, they say, where is it? You say, well, it's south about 5 miles, it's east 2 blocks, and it's 52 floors up in so-and-so tower. In other words, you give them the coordinates. Again, that's relationism. It's not relativism. There's no doubt where the meeting point is. You just have to make it clear by making the relationships between these points clear. Anyway, I'm just trying to clear up that in the public mind there's confusion between those two things. Relationism is a kind of absolute. For example, even the great philosopher Bertrand Russell said years ago in a book he wrote about this very topic, he said that relation itself is a universal concept. For example, Toronto, where I live, north of Toronto, will always be north of New York City. It's never going to be south or east or west or whatever of New York City. It's always going to be north of New York City. And words themselves, he argued, and I agree with him, are in their conceptual basis universal concepts. For example, the word cut, the word cat, or the word dog, until we actually specify what philosophers call the particulars of the cat or the dog, we have a universal concept of a cat in our mind. It's like a Platonic form, which is definable, 4 legs, fur, meow, not bark, and all that kind of thing, which tells you what a cat is. These are universal concepts. So much for Russell. He was a smart dude. However, there has also always existed in all societies a movement towards what modern people call anti-foundationalism. Let's get rid of the kinds of foundations, the idea of the platform, which is fixed at the train station, the idea that Toronto's north of New York, what if the world was upside down? It would be south, that kind of argument. At any rate, there's always been these kind of movements to unsettle the certainty that people have about the nature and the world around them. Probably the first and most famous ancient thinker on this score was Protagoras. He's the one who was famous for the statement that man is the measure of all things. And so, of course, that's false in itself, because it basically means if man decides whether everything is true or not true, just like the guy at the cocktail party that I mentioned, then there's nothing that's necessarily true. Now, Plato and Aristotle took a piece out of Protagoras and really ridiculed his philosophy. But Protagoras was really the first sophist in ancient times, the first man who started charging people for his philosophy lessons. And the first thing he tried to teach them all was that there's no such thing as philosophy. How could there be, since you decide, or I decide, what's philosophical and what isn't? So in a sense, you can see that his own philosophy was mocking him. At any rate, in the long history of the West, I'm going to go through this quickly now so we can get to the meat and potatoes of my book of absolutes. Along came the Nominalists. And the Nominalists really were led by William of Ockham and so on, were fighting the idea that there are such things as essences and enduring concepts in the universe. There's only things, and things have names, and that's why the philosophy is called nominalism. So the whole thrust of the thing there was that, except for the will of God, which makes all the final decisions, man cannot understand the world through these concepts, only through things that he encounters in his experience. And I'm sorry to be going so fast, but then there was, Descartes in the Western tradition, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, him trying to reduce all human knowledge to the starting point of the human mind. He had difficulties with that because he ended up with two kinds of reality, the mind, what he called res cogitans, and the things outside the mind, which he called extended things, res extensa, things that have shape and dimension and weight and all that outside the mind. But he never could explain how those two things got together. How could the mind understand the res cogitans, understand what the res extensa actually was? So at any rate, these were types of doubt that got generated in the Western tradition. Then came, Galileo's huge shock, this proof that the Earth was no longer the center of the universe. That was an enormous blow to the Western mind. I think, in a way, it still is. And one of the reasons we have so many scientists out there trying to find life on other planets is because they're trying to recover some understanding of this vast universe, which takes it out of the realm of the unbelievable. That there's more Earth-like planets, then the universe becomes possibly more of a home for man again, as it was so firmly before Galileo upset us all, Copernicus, Galileo, whatever. At any rate, and then we have political philosophers like Hobbes and his relativity of morals. I mean, Hobbes made the argument, excuse me, I get my screen back here. Hobbes made the argument, among many others, he was a smart dude. He made the argument that the good is whatever satisfies our desires, and evil is whatever does not satisfy our desires, whatever we hate. So he was making morality subjective philosophically. And that these words were to be defined in relation to the person using them. So boy, you can see the trouble brewing for modernity here, And then we had political upheavals like the French Revolution. I'll tell you just a brief story about the French Revolution. When a famous Chinese politician these days, a few years ago, was asked, what do you think the effect of the French Revolution was on Western society? You know what he said? He said, it's too soon to tell. In a sense, he was correct. We're talking here about long, deep movements that have long, deep effects, which don't necessarily come to an end quickly. And I do think we are still living with many of those effects from the French Revolution. for example. There we had attacks on Christianity, which until that time had been the
William,
main,
William,
yes?
if I may stop you for a second, can you elaborate a little more about the effects of the French Revolution? Just a little more, please.
Yes, right away. Well, one
Thank
of the
you.
main ones was its defense of so-called reason. And some of this, of course, was drawn from Descartes. I think, therefore I am. That the proof of my being is my ability to think. Some more recent philosophers, like the great Etienne Gilson, have said that's nonsense. I am, therefore I think. The only reason I think is because I exist. It's wrong to say I think, therefore I am. But anyway, the reason that Descartes was doing this was because he wanted to construct a strict kind of structure, a rational structure, in order to understand the world. And so during the French Revolution, what happened? Part of the attack on Christianity was a direct attack on that beautiful cathedral of Notre Dame, which so sadly got burnt a few years ago and is being reconstructed. But during the French Revolution, the revolutionaries, all in the name of reason, went marching into Notre Dame Cathedral, and they tore down the images of Christ and tore down the crosses and burned the altars and all that sort of thing. And they erected about a 35-foot papier-mâché statue of the goddess of reason. And around the goddess of reason, they would do their dances and their chanting in the name of the goddess of reason. This is what they were celebrating. Never guessing for a moment that, reason is kind of like a hammer. You can get a nail into something you're building with a hammer, or you can kill somebody with it. It's just a tool. It has no particular virtue in itself, and it can be used to defend great evils, morally speaking. So you can see where I'm going here. If you take away the moral bubble over the whole community, and you allow everybody their own private bubble of morality, it's much easier to break society down. And I have to tell you, in 2006, there was a law case in Canada called the L'Abbé. Everything here is against the Queen, not necessarily against individuals. So it's Regina versus L'Abbé. Regina is the Latin word for the Queen. So the Queen versus L'Abbé. L'Abbé ran basically a sex operation above a variety store in a quiet community. And the community got really upset about it, and they protested and took him to court. And the local court defended the community and tried to shut it, told him he had to shut down. He took it to the Supreme Court of the province of Quebec because of that. And the Supreme Court defended him. And you know who they pointed to in his defense? John Stuart Mill, who was really still is the father of the modern libertarian view, called the harm principle, which is basically the notion that individuals live within their own moral bubbles, not within any larger moral bubble. And the only thing they have to be concerned about is not, say, harm to the community or harm to the country or whatever. It's just harm to any other individual, in particular person. And they actually cited Mill's, I'm going to say infamous book on liberty. It's a small book, but I'm going to say, forced to read it when I was a freshman student at McGill University by an English professor. Now, what the English professor was doing, forcing all the students to read this little political tract by John Stuart Mill, I don't know, but it's a very famous little booklet in which his harm principle is articulated. And it boils down to this idea that you can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm another. And he gives you then he goes into other sections of the book into the various reasons why you can interfere with someone else's liberty. And there are very few of those. For example, he doesn't think you should be able to interfere with someone who wants to harm themselves, or anything like that. It's a very simple principle, and that's what he called it. Interestingly, I read Mill's autobiography, which is a really good read. He was a very influential and bright fellow, too bright for his own good, actually. And he fell in love with another man's wife. And he was having relations with her without telling the husband. So he and the guy's wife were running off enjoying themselves. The husband, who was a disabled man in a wheelchair, whatever disease he had, I don't know. But Mill goes through a certain amount of moral kind of gymnastics in his autobiography, where he justifies his behavior with the man's wife on the grounds that the man didn't know. And because he didn't know, it didn't harm him. You see what he did. So his harm principle was really very much a kind of self-justifying principle, which he worked out with the guy's wife, whose name was Harriet Taylor. I don't want to go on too much about Mill, but I wrote a paper on him, which I would encourage your listeners to read. It's about John Stuart Mill and the origins of what I call libertarian socialism, because Mill was both. He was a radical libertarian, but he was also increasingly a socialist as he got older. And he was raised by a very dogmatic, very intellectually oriented father who was very much a utilitarian. And in fact, Mill became the editor of Bentham's treatise on utilitarianism as a young man. I mean, Mill was a young man when he did it, and so on. But when he met Harriet Taylor, she was nothing like Mill. She was a romantic person in her feelings and her love of poetry. And she loved the poetry of Wordsworth and John Keats and all that kind of stuff. I mean, some of the most beautiful poetry in the English language was written by those two people and many others. She knew them all, and she knew romantic poetry. But Mill had never read a poem in his damn life. In fact, after he met Harriet, and she turned him on to the reality of emotions which came out of poetry, Mill had never believed that a poem could make him actually feel, deeply about something that he hadn't ever even thought about. And he, in his autobiography, he said it was a moment of lament when he said, "I was never a boy. I was never a boy," he said. And what he meant was his dad was forcing him to read Latin and Greek authors and all that kind of stuff. When he was 6 years old, the guy was reading Plutarch in Latin, whatever. But I was never a boy, he said. I never played at cricket. And he might have added, I never read poetry. But Harriet introduced him to poetry. And Mill, people don't know much about this, which is why I'm very happy to urge your people to look for that paper. Just put my name in the internet and the words poetry and the mystique of the self in John Stuart Mill, and the paper will pop up. I'm proud of it. I think it's a good piece. And no one, I think, ever before has really dug into this aspect of Mill's life and how it was poetry that pushed him in the direction of what I call libertarian socialism politically. At any rate, it's enough of the story on John Stuart Mill. But you can see that his harm principle did not have a very morally upright origin, to say the least. I don't know if the husband, by the way, was ever told of their goings on. Anyway, you can run through a whole bunch of other philosophers like Locke and his tabula rasa. All intelligence in the mind comes from experience, because the mind is just a tabula rasa. There's nothing in it to begin with. That is much disputed today, by the way, by evolutionary psychologists and people like that, who actually know a lot more about the workings of the actual brain than Locke ever knew. And then we had Hume. Hume, by the way, you could call the first major conservative philosopher, and he's much misunderstood, especially by religious people who think he was just a damn atheist and all that, which he wasn't. He just didn't like the way damn Christians called themselves Christians, but weren't living like Christians. He had no problem with Christ or Christianity. He just didn't like people faking it. But anyway, from Hume, we got this devastating idea that there's no possibility of proving causation in the universe, because we can prove that two things happen together, for example, but we can't prove causation, because just because the sun comes up today doesn't mean it's going to come up tomorrow. You can't prove that it's going to come up tomorrow. Fortunately, it does, and we're glad for that. But he basically worked out a simple but in a way elaborate demonstration that there's no proof for causality. Now, this interests me because I made a little study of Islam in my life when all this Islamic terrorism got started. And there's a wonderful book, by the way. I can't remember the name of the author now, but I remember the title, and your people will love it. It's very short. It's called The Closing of the Muslim Mind. A very interesting book, which takes you into the sources of modern Islamic terrorist philosophy from the beginning. And basically, in Islam, there was a war between two different variations of Islam, between what they call the Asharites and the Mutazilites, the complicated names. But the long and short of it is that Al-Ghazali, who was one of the big Asharite philosophers, he won out. And Al-Ghazali took the view that causality cannot be proved, just like Hume in the English tradition, except long before him. What Ghazali said was, if you put a match or a little piece of wood that's on fire, if you put it to a ball of cotton, the cotton catches fire. But there's no proof it's going to catch fire every time. It catches fire because God makes it catch fire. This is called occasionalism in philosophy, and he basically took you through the same steps that Hume takes us through in his demonstration that you cannot prove causality. You can only remark upon it and say, it seems to happen every time, and I think I got a good idea it's going to happen again tomorrow, but you can't prove that philosophically. So anyway, these things are interesting because they tend to undermine the moral basis of society and the confidence that people have that there's even a real world out there. Look at Kant. Kant's idea was that the mind shapes reality. We can't know reality directly. Of course, my response to Kant, too bad he's not here. He was a very bright guy, and he'd probably kill me in a direct argument. But I would say, how do you know you can't know reality? Because you have to know reality in order to know that you can't know it. You know what I mean? Otherwise, how would you know that you can't know it? So his idea was anyway that the mind is like an instrument, like a cookie cutter. You know, when people make pastry, there's a little star-shaped one and a circular one and so on, and they push it into the dough and they get cookies of a certain kind. Well, Kant's view was that the human mind is like a cookie cutter, and it stamps reality out that it sees. The pastry of reality gets stamped in a certain way according to how we perceive it. All these things are background to the problem of modern relativism.
William, I would like to ask, in the absence of people, if people don't exist, does truth exist? Objective truth exist? I mean, what is the base of all this abstract thinking and the concept that we have and the representations of reality? It's all something based on physical absolute reality, right?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I wrote an article a few years ago called "There's No Morality on the Moon." And the argument was that some fellow has taken a spaceship to the moon and he runs out of gas. And there's only him there. There's no other human beings. And so my argument was that unless we're talking about his relationship to God, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, but I'm leaving that aside for the moment, because there are no other humans with whom he can interact. There's nobody that he can do evil to or who can do evil things to him. I guess you could say he could harm himself or something like that. But outside the human context, it's hard to come up with a rational defense of the idea that morality exists on the moon, for example.
But the moon exists.
The moon exists, yeah, but the moon is neither moral nor immoral. It's just a thing. It has no moral nature. But if you're asking me if there's truth, is there physical truth? Yeah, I'm not like Berkeley. I mean, Professor Berkeley, whoever, Berkeley argued that everything is created by the mind, which I think that was demonstrably foolish. And I think on the other hand, it's interesting you're asking this, because in my chapter on physics, I do talk about something called the anthropic principle, which is kind of the notion that the human mind has a lot to do with the construction of physical reality. Certainly that seems to be true at the quantum level. I don't know myself how true it is in the macro level. And now we're leaping way forward in the book. I don't know if you want me to go through all this other background stuff. It does interest me, but the European relativists were like, Hegel, it's all dialectical. History is driving all this, and it's a dialectical process. There's no fixed reality, it's dialectical reality. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then all around again. Johannes Herder was a cultural relativist, and that came up to haunt us in the 20th century because the Nazi Party really hooked on to Herder, who was no dummy either, but his idea was, that every culture is unique and to be defended in its own right, and that's what the Germans did with the German culture in the Nazi period. And then there was Nietzsche, of course, and Nietzsche's most famous relativistic statement was, there are no facts, only interpretations. Well, you couldn't get much closer to the modern, postmodern, deconstructionist world of, say, Jacques Derrida, who was no fool either, but we can talk about him in a bit. He was a real tricky dicky when it came to philosophical statements. This idea that every text, in a sense, deconstructs itself. So there is no real text there. But there's nothing outside the text either. So everything is being conditioned by language. So, there's no facts, only interpretations. It is completely wrong. And in the Book of Absolutes, I went a long way to try to demonstrate that. And if you'd like me to, I can take your listeners through some of the demonstrations of the facts. In the book, they'll find a chapter on the various types of relativism, like ethical and moral relativism, the relativism of things, which we find in all sorts of writers. For example, in Virginia Woolf, a novel by Virginia Woolf called The Waves, there's a whole bunch of characters running around, each with a different view of a situation. So the only one who knows the whole story is the reader. None of the characters do, because they're only seeing it from a particular perspective. And in films like Kurosawa's movie Rashomon, where there's a murder, and the whole movie you're trying to figure out who did it. Well, the thing is being seen from different perspectives all the way through the movie. Therefore, there's no true perspective, is what these people are trying to get at. And I don't know why, but a lot of these artists, writers, novelists, filmmakers just fall in love with this idea that there's no reality out there. We're all just making it up, Nevertheless, if someone steals their wallet, suddenly there's a reality. Stealing is wrong, and they call the police. There's no more relativism in situations like that. A big one, I think, is cultural relativism. And on this, in America at least, and when I went to school as an undergraduate in the 60s, we got a great big fat book in anthropology class called Cultural Relativism. And the whole idea was that all cultures are relative. None of them are the same. They all have different ideas of truth and love and everything else. And so we can't talk about anything constant or absolute in human cultures. This was a revolution against earlier views, which were that there is such a thing as human nature, there is such a thing as culture, and there are such things as good cultures and bad cultures. But oh boy, you try that argument today, and you still get in all kinds of trouble for it. But that didn't scare me. I wanted to write about cultural relativism and where it came from and where it went, because it didn't stay that way. Its biggest thrust in America was from Columbia University and a man named Franz Boas. Franz Boas was a brilliant Jewish scholar who was horrified by what the Nazis had done during the Second World War, never wanted to see it again. And he became the main voice behind cultural relativism in the Western world. And, his work was translated by everyone. And some of his students were the main cultural relativist anthropologists, like Margaret Mead and others whose names escape me at the moment. But so I want to tell you a little story about what happened, because I'm now on chapter 4 of the book, which is getting into the meat of the issues here. It's called The Universals of Human Life and Culture. And what got me going on this topic after reading and writing about Boas was a professor at the University of California, I forget which campus, named Donald Brown. He wrote a book called Human Universals, and I bought it immediately because I was trying to gather materials for my book of absolutes. And then I communicated with him. We had some nice sort of exchanges over the internet and all that, and exchanged documents. But he was at graduate school, I think Berkeley or someplace like that. And very much a cultural relativist. Like he drank the Kool-Aid of cultural relativism. But one of the students had not. His graduate student buddies had not. And he came up to Brown one day and he said, there's I'm going to make you a bet, because he knew that Brown was very much a relativist. And Brown says, what's the bet? He said, there's something I think has been done by every society throughout history. And I'm going to bet you $50. You can't find a society that didn't do it. I don't know what the thing was. It's in his book. I've forgotten. But Brown immediately took the bet. He said, sure, that's going to be easy. So Brown runs off to the graduate library, and he spends a few hours looking for any culture in the history of the world that didn't do what the guy said every culture does. And he couldn't find one, and he was shocked. So he went back again at night, and he went back the next day, and finally he gave up. He said, okay, he said, here's your $50. But that must be the only damn thing in the world like that. And the other guy said, no. He said, here's another one. And so Brown went at it again. And believe me, by the time he failed the second time, he was devastated, because his whole kind of religion of anthropology and cultural relativism was falling by the wayside because of this fellow. And so Brown changed horses, and he said, I'm getting more education from you than from any of my professors. They're all clearly wrong. People like Boas are clearly wrong. And by the way, the subtext here is that Boas was pushing relativism because he didn't want any more absolutists. He didn't want Nazis running around saying, this is the way the world should be. And he figured if he could push the relativist story, no one would be able to do it as easily again. I'm just adding that as a footnote. But anyway, Brown not only changed, but he became one of the world's experts on what he eventually called human universals. And I just want to read for your listeners something in the chapter that he wrote about this. Bear with me. It takes a moment. I got to get a light going here. So this is just an extract from his own book on human universals and culture. And when you read this to a relativist, and they're floating all over the place even today, they don't know what to say. Here's what he wrote. He said, all humans use language as their principal medium of communication. And all human languages have the same underlying architecture. built of the same basic units and arranged according to implicit rules of grammar and other common features. All people classify themselves in terms of status, class, roles, and kinship, and all practice division of labor by age and gender. Many human facial expressions are universal and elicit the same emotional responses everywhere. All cultures have poetry, figurative speech, symbolic speech, ceremonial speech, metaphor, and the like. All use logic. All reckon time, distinguish the past, present, and the future. They think in causal terms. They recognize the concept and possibility of cheating and lying, and they strive to protect themselves from the same. They distinguish inner from outer body, emotions, sensations, and thoughts. They distinguish flora and fauna, motion, speed, location, dimension, and other physical properties of the world. Then they also have concepts of dualism, polar extremes, parts and wholes, opposites and equivalents. They have the ability to count, to see the self as subject or object, to distinguish normal from abnormal mental states, to experience empathy, make tools, have patterns of socialization and sexual regulation, have incest avoidance. They use reciprocity. They distinguish public from private. They have government, leaders, laws, rules of conduct, sanctions, punishment. They distinguish right from wrong and responsibility and intention. They have religion, etiquette, hospitality, standards of sexual modesty, a worldview, rituals, rules of inheritance, and so forth. And so I'm sorry that was a bit long, but you get the idea. That's in Brown's book, as are many other things. And he calls those obvious or surface universals of all humanity for all time, every culture that we know of, ever since we've ever known that there were cultures. He says there are other universals likely to come in the future, which are less easy to see. Structural universals, relational universals, which are not necessarily on the surface of these societies. And that's, future work for future experts. At any rate, this chapter was a big, in his book and in my book, was a big blow to readers who went to cocktail parties and said things like, it's true for you, but it's not true for me, and so on. So I'm just enjoying sharing it with you because it's making a mess of the relativist story. The next chapter in my book is called The Constants of Nature. And this was a lot of fun too, because I'm no physicist, but I had to get into a lot of reading and thinking about physics and nature and cosmology, because Albert Einstein is still considered by everybody to be the kind of father of relativism because of his so-called theory of relativity. It actually had a longer name than that. But Einstein scolded himself all the rest of his life because that term became so famous. He said what he was trying to show was, given certain absolutes and particular features of physical reality, it looks the same no matter where you are in the universe to all observers. And he wanted to call his theory, get this, he wanted to call it the theory of invariance and not the theory of relativity, but it became called the theory of invariance. And it so happens that one of his own relatives, I can't remember his name now, but he was a relative of Einstein. And he went to court. He went to jail first, and then he ended up in court for, I don't think it was a murder, but it was an attempted killing or something like that. And he tried to justify it on the theory of relativity that Einstein, everything is relative, Your Honor. Morality is relative. Einstein proved it. And when Einstein heard his own relative using that line in a court of law, you know what he said? he said, I should have been a watchmaker. Like, it so discouraged him to think that someone thought everything was relative. And he was the one who said, God does not play dice. There's nothing relative about it. So anyway, in this chapter, you'll find sections on the main forces of nature, like gravity, the electromagnetic force, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, and all that kind of thing. And a list at the end of the book. There's 35 pages in the appendix of the Book of Absolutes, which gives you a list of all sorts of absolutes and universals of nature and human nature. And I don't know if your viewers have actually seen this book. I'm going to hold it up. This is the book. It's called A Critique of Relativism and a Defense of Universals. And anybody who's ever wanted to know if these things actually exist is going to feel tremendous relief when they read about these things, including the universals and constants of biology, human biology and animal biology, and so on. Like, they're everywhere. Here's a paragraph I want to read you on physics. Published in a book by two physicists named Barrow and Tipler. They say one of the most important results of 20th century physics has been the gradual realization that there exist invariant properties of the natural world and its elementary components, which render the gross size and structure of virtually all its constituents quite inevitable. The size of stars and planets, and even of people, are neither random nor the result of any Darwinian selection process from a myriad of possibilities. These and other gross features of the universe are the consequences of necessity. They are manifestations of the possible equilibrium states between competing forces of attraction and repulsion. He means at the level of quanta and things like that. The intrinsic strengths of these controlling forces of nature are determined by a mysterious collection of pure numbers that we call the constants of nature. And in my book, you'll see what they're talking about. The holy grail of modern physics is to explain why these numerical constants, quantities like the ratio of the proton and electron masses, for example, have the particular numerical values that they do. So it's interesting, if you buy a book of essays by some of the most prominent physicists in the world, you'll find that most of them will tell you that they're Platonists. They believe that there are realities of the universe which are fixed and absolute and forever, and they're out there to be discovered. And most of the terms of physics themselves, which they manipulate in their formulas, are like that. So it's interesting that whereas in the 19th century, human biology, for example, was a very was a certain kind of field stressing the fluctuations of nature, it's becoming more physical in the sense of biology and biological features of all of life. Whereas physics, which in the 19th century was very strictly numerical, very mathematical, and so on, has become almost a quasi-mystical field of experience. If you read about the experiments of Niels Bohr and the Copenhagen explanation and things like that, you'll see what I mean. For example, the Two-Slit Experiment, as it's called, is still a great mystery to a lot of people. I mean, how does that work? So I don't know if your listeners are familiar with it, but there's a kind of wall right in front of you, and it's got two slits in it. And the experimenter is sitting back here where I am, and he's got a photon gun. And this photon gun, when he pulls the trigger or whatever, it'll fire a single photon at this little wall. And the question is, which of those slits is the photon going to go through? Well, it so happens if you do nothing, it'll go through each of them kind of equally, 50%. And at the back of this wall, there's a kind of photosensitive screen where the photons make a mark. And when they get to the screen, you see waves, you know. So the question really is, how does a particle that leaves the gun and goes through these little slits become a wave on the other side of the wall? Well, I don't understand it myself. I'm just saying I'm fascinated to read about it. But there's a couple of things which I don't think anybody understands. And that is, there's slit A and there's slit B. And if the experimenter closes slit A, like he tells the guy with the gun, shoot it, aim it at slit A. And just after it leaves the gun, this tiny particle, quantum particle, but before it gets to the slit, he closes the slit. And the damn thing goes over and it goes through slit B instead of proceeding to slit A. And so the question in the mind of any physicist is, how does it do that? Like, how does the little photon of energy know that slit A has closed and changed its direction to go through slit B? Even more spooky. And there's a lot of spooky things in physics. If the experimenter closes it on the way to slit A and then quickly opens it again, the photon keeps going through slit A. It's like it knows he's trying to fool it. Now, how can a quantum particle, know anything? Anyway, I hope people who get to this book, and I hope everybody watching will get it, because it's a good experience, and there's a lot of that kind of thing discussed in it. Which I think you will enjoy. The universals of biology and what I call brain sex. It's a title that I lifted from another writer who wrote a book about the differences between men and women biologically, and you see all the kind of pushback we're getting today about that. People trying to argue that the sexes are the same. So much so that gender is just an imposition, that you can change your gender by the use of your own will, just by calling yourself she or whatever pronoun you want to use instead of he, for example. So in this chapter, however, you see the hardcore science of biology with respect to humanity in general and what I call brain sex. So the male-female differences are outlined quite extensively in this book, and there are a lot of them. And you could sum that topic up by using a quote from one of the contributors to that research, who said that boys and girls are just as different above the neck as they are below. Because in his book, he was dealing with brain differences and perception differences and reaction times and ways of conceiving of physical reality. I've often seen some of these work out in my own life. One of the things that they noticed was that if you ask men for directions, they'll tend to give you compass directions. Well, just go north 3 blocks and then go east 4 blocks, and you see it on your right inside. But the woman will tend to say, go north until you see the donut shop on your left hand, and then turn left and go, and so on. So the women in these experiments tend to describe directions in terms of things that they've seen and noticed that are physical and actually there. And the men tend to do it abstractly in terms of compass directions. Who knows how much of that is learned and how much of that is innate? I don't, but the book discusses that and talks about it. So I think you'll enjoy it a lot. Another topic in this book is what I call natural law. This is an important chapter too, because we're living at a time when the law is being reconceived by a lot of jurists as a living tree. You've all heard that expression, I'm sure. In Canada, it's been used explicitly to describe Canada's so-called Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was created in 1982 by our Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau. And I'm going to say it was kind of downloaded on the people when they didn't know what the hell he was doing, really. And what he really was doing, I have to say, was he was bringing French principles of law to Canada, which for its whole history had existed on the foundation of British law, common law, legislative law. Parliament was the supreme law of Canada, just as today Parliament gives the supreme law of Britain and England. But once Trudeau created his charter, he dropped it on top of Canada's form of government and called it the supreme law of Canada. But no one knew what that law was. No one knew how it was to be interpreted. For example, Section 15 is about equality, and it tells you what equality, how it should be applied and to what groups, and so on. But no one knew what equality meant. Parliament didn't create the charter. A bunch of lawyers did for Trudeau, and they put it in this thing called a charter. And now it's the supreme law of Canada. People seem to like it, but they don't realize that he Francofied Canada. He made Canada more French because, the French have always had a kind of code law. And this came out of their tradition with Descartes and the reliance on reason and all the rest of it. The law should be argued from principles at the top. It should not be created through legislation from the bottom or through the will of the people or any of that. In fact, our own Prime Minister Trudeau had only a sense of distaste and repugnance for our parliamentarians. He basically, I'm not quoting, but he basically called them a bunch of losers. In fact, I think that was the quote. They're a bunch of losers in Parliament. And he took the view of Canada, the French view of Canada, that Voltaire took of England when he visited England. What he said was, you English people, when you're going from one part of the country to the other, he said, you change your laws as often as you change your horses, which was a funny line. But Trudeau didn't like that either. He thought the law should be singular, monumental, like a pyramid, covering the whole country, and should be decided by judges, not by legislators. Legislators are just people who are elected by the mob, and they don't know much. But, trained judges, they know a lot. And so we want judges to decide how the country should be run. And that's the way Canada is today. And the strange thing is most citizens are unaware of what I just told you. They don't know that they have lost the right of the people to express themselves through their own laws. These will always now be modified, thrown out as unconstitutional, whatever, if they don't meet the standards that some judge or judges have declared in the nation's top court, where they can say that any law we make is unconstitutional. Now, the result of this has been that our people has been infantilized. Canadian Parliament has been infantilized. I'll tell you in what sense. In the sense that if a dicey topic comes up in the legislature, like say abortion or gender or who knows what topic, they won't discuss it. They just kick it upstairs to the court. Let the judges decide. Oh, we're not going to get into that. That's to infantilize your parliament, which took I don't know how many centuries to create the privileges that it had of in fact deliberating these things in the name of the people. It's all gone now. They will deliberate smaller things like raising taxes. That's not hard. They do that all the time. They don't bother going to the court over that. But any of these dicey moral issues, kick them upstairs. We're not going to bother with it. That's why I say Parliament in Canada has been infantilized. And in a sense, we've been returned to our colonial tradition. It took Canada a few hundred years to get its own constitution away from the British in the British North America Act. Before that, all the major decisions about Canadian life were decided by British jurists or the Privy Council over there across the pond. Then we got our right to make our own laws and so on. And now we gave them away again. But we gave them away to judges who were living here instead of in England. So that's why I call this the Revenge of Montcalm. For those of you listeners who don't know, there was something called the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759, in which the English, under General Wolfe, won the Battle of the Plains of Abraham near Quebec City against General Montcalm, who was fighting for the French. Both Wolfe and Montcalm died in that battle, but I call what's happened since this francization of Canada's legal system as the Revenge of Montcalm. So we won the battle, but he won the war, you might say. At any rate, in this book, my chapter on the law, there's 2 chapters on it. The thrust of it is natural law. Is there such a thing as natural law? And if so, what is it? Well, you can't bottle it and sell it, but you can make strong arguments for the idea that there is such a thing as natural law. That's what Cicero did. He wrote wonderfully about the existence of the natural law. All men believe in right and wrong. All men believe that there's truth and falsehood, contra Protagoras, by the way. And all men believe that might does not make right. All men believe thou shalt not steal. All men believe you should honor your mother and father, and all these kind of things which come out of the natural law. Now I came up with I'm going to say my own kind of variation on this in the book. And I define natural law as an ordinance or a command, let's say. It's a command of right reason that follows nature for the common good. So it's a command or a law. And it's a command of right reason, not wrong reason. Because as I say, reason is like a hammer. You can kill people with it or do great evil. So it's about right reason. Reason pursuing the good and pursuing truth and the common good of all. So that's right reason. So a command of right reason that follows nature for the common good. It doesn't follow nature in the sense of for the bad, because it is true that some people by nature want to kill each other. That's a bad use of the word nature, and it's a bad consequence of following nature. So the idea that it's a command of right reason that follows nature for the common good is, I think, a pretty watertight description of how the natural law operates. Now, the natural law is out of favor in most law schools in the West. One of the first speeches I gave was at Queen's University in Ontario to the Students' Law Society. The graduate students formed a society there, and they invited me to speak. And I should move my screen because over that, the other way. See that thing there called protest? And that's a flyer that they were distributing at the university. And I got a copy of it. And it's on my wall because it was created by the Socialist International. And there are very few authors in this country who have a poster like that. It says protesting the speech by William Gairdner and so on and so on. But I went there to speak about these very things, about the law, at the law school. And I debated a feminist professor there who was a very bright, interesting woman, but I think barking up the wrong tree. And she would tell her students that natural law was a joke, However, it's not a joke. And a great philosopher named Etienne Johnson once said, that the natural law will always bury its undertakers, which is what it does. And that happened after the Second World War, when the war criminals from the Nazi regime were tried at Nuremberg. All the judges who had been trained and brought up to believe that natural law was not real anymore. This was especially emphasized by a German jurist named Hans Kelsen, who wrote extensively about how there's only one definition of law that matters, and that's an ordinance of a properly justified political community. I'm not quoting him directly, but it's something like that. He would basically saying if you have a properly organized political community and the powers that be, the sovereign in the community makes a law, then it's a law. However, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of my favorite philosophers in the 13th century, he said, lex injusta non est lex. So what he said in Latin was that an unjust law is not a law. Well, I differ with even Thomas. It is a law because it's called a law, but it's not a just law. And it's not considered a law by the people because when they know it's not just, they don't want to obey it. And they don't consider it a law that's binding morally. So well, guess what happened in the trials at Nuremberg was the judges called these guys up, the guys who had shot and murdered and bludgeoned, and they were throwing 6-pound babies to each other and catching them on their bayonets and all kinds of terrible things. I mean, even as individuals, let alone giving orders to shoot innocent people for almost nothing. And the judges would say to them, "Why did you do it?" Something so obviously immoral. And they said, "Well, I was told to do it. I was ordered to do it. In fact, my superior said if I don't do it, he would shoot me. What did you want me to do, Your Honor?" And what the judges argued at the time was that they should have obeyed the natural law, that what the soldier was calling the positive law, the simple order that he got from, the terrible order that he got from his boss, was human law. You should have obeyed the natural law, instead. And you didn't. So we're going to punish you. Well, there are people who criticize all these trials as victor's justice. I'm not sure what to say about that. It's true there's such a thing as victor's justice. It's one of the rights that victors have, is to punish their enemies even after the fight. But the case that I'm trying to make is there is such a thing as natural law. Aquinas himself, by the way, came up with the first ever strict description of natural international law, which many countries still abide by. And no one can really explain why almost every nation in the world has come up with terms of international law, which are natural and considered binding on everybody, even though they never really got together until recent times to have a conference on these things. Anyway, I think
William.
yeah.
Yeah. First, thank you very much for the amazing information you are imparting to us. That's incredible. But you are already going for 1 hour and 10 minutes, and I don't want to burden you. And I'm sure there is a lot more to the book, so perhaps we can continue that next week, if you're okay with that.
Sure, if you like to, or get back to work. It's a family. It's up to you.
No, I would like to continue and summarize the book and finish the other chapters. But if you still have the energy, can we take a few questions now?
Sure.
Okay, so maybe even a small discussion, if you will allow it. One of our admins is JJ here, and JJ, please go ahead.
Hi, William. How are you?
Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we actually our main focus for what we do with our group is we actually focus on the natural law. We're really digging in deep into that. So I commend you for making those points, and I agree with you. pretty much across the board in what you've said so far. Going back to your points of relativism, do you find in what you've researched and what you've dug into concerning that what people are confusing as relative truth is just simply perspective?
Yes, I don't know if you were here for the first part of this discussion, but I think they confuse what I call relationism with relativism. And I gave the example of the guy sitting in the train station. He's not sure which car is moving. And he finds out when he sees the platform that it's not him, it's the other car beside him. But people today, they don't know what historical relativism is. I think what they're basically telling us when they go to that position is that I have my own moral world, you have your moral world, yours has nothing to do with me. I'll decide what I think is right and wrong, what's true and what's not true. And that's why we get the expression, which is a terrible expression, that something is true for you but not true for me. And if you say to them, such as I did, it can't be true and false at the same time. One of us must be wrong. It's very discouraging that they will not take up the challenge and actually have a discussion with you. They walk away. And I think society is in trouble. Any society is in trouble when people hear that statement and walk away from it. I think I mentioned to you last time we were together that when I was a young man, if you were at a dinner table, even an 18, 19-year-old man who doesn't know very much, but has all kinds of opinions, which we do at that age, if you were asked a question at the dinner table by a family member or a guest of the family, usually, and you gave an answer to the question, you were expected to defend it on logical grounds. Like, how can you say that? You're expected to defend it. If you had said something like, well, it's true for you, but it's not true for me, they would have laughed you right off the table. Not with cruelty, but just, listen, young man, you're not going to get away with that, So we grew up being expected to defend ourselves. So I will say there was a lot of silence around the table because you knew you might be called to account. And I think we live in a society now where we're not prepared to call people to account. For many years, I would take my kids to hockey games. We play a lot of ice hockey in Canada, but it doesn't matter what the game is or was, soccer, ice hockey, whatever. And sometimes in these stadiums, you'll hear the foulest language coming from some of the younger kids in the stands, and their parents aren't saying anything. Kids using the F word, and their parents aren't saying anything to them. Well, sometimes I say it to them instead, and their parents give me hell for disciplining their kids. And I don't do it very often, but if it's something my family can hear, I do. I ask them to take it down to the other end of the arena, please. And you shouldn't be speaking like that, young man. That's foul language in front of nice people here, But it seems to be gone now. People are afraid, and there used to be something in the Christian tradition. I can't remember the exact phrase now, but it was like brotherly correction. The idea that you had a duty to correct each other if you were doing something wrong or something like I just described. It was a duty. And if you didn't do it, you were the one who failed, not just the person who did it. So I'm not asking each of us to police each other in some draconian way, but where are the expectations of decent behavior gone that we all used to share in the common moral bubble? Well, when you have your own moral bubble and you think foul language is okay, you're not sharing anymore. So I think we have to bring back do our duty to bring back the common moral bubble, and we can't do it unless we speak up. And it's terribly discouraging to see what a hard time people have speaking up. Parents, they see, my son saw his beautiful 6-year-old daughter, maybe she's almost 7 now, coming home with a book about how Susie has 2 mummies and so on. Well, Susie may have 2 people who both call themselves mummy, but Susie can't have 2 mummies. And my son didn't start there. He went right to the principal and engaged him in a discussion, not over the fact that such a book even existed, which he thought was wrong in itself, but why is the school normalizing the abnormal? And he said to the teacher, toleration and normalization are not the same thing. Why have we lost that distinction? And he himself said to the teacher, I'm not trying to be cruel to anybody. I'm just trying to preserve some normal type of life that my children can grow up with without being thrown off their bearings by a teacher. And by the way, we're seeing that in the US now, every night on TV, whatever. There's some revolt down there about who should be teaching the kids what. Well, there's been, and by the way, in the War Against the Family, there's 4 chapters on education, which I guess we'll get to if you can put up with me that long. There's 4 chapters on education, and those chapters are so devastating. I tell you, if you're going to read them, they're very current. They were written 33 years ago, but they're very current. And if you're going to read them, you better be sitting down, because you're going to have tears in your eyes or running down your cheeks with some of those chapters. It's absolutely shocking to see what's going on in the schools. And this is not new. In my book, you'll see 30 years ago, this stuff was quite shocking. Now, some teachers deal with it in a certain way. I remember interviewing one of them. She said, Mr. Gairdner, she said, it's true, I'm supposed to teach X, Y, and Z, this stuff that you're complaining about. She said, but when I close that door, this classroom is mine, meaning that was her way of protesting, you know. But it's a broader ideological matter. We had a member of parliament in the West here, in the province of Alberta, who was notorious one day and quoted in the newspapers by standing up at a parent-teacher meeting where he said, those children are not your children. They don't belong to you. They belong to the state. They're like our coal and our oil. So that's what he said. And the parents, of course, were shocked. What are you talking about? But I mean, this goes back to our discussion of Plato when we talked about that. Plato's idea was that the children did not belong to the families or their parents. He said, no parent shall know his child, nor child his parent. The state will take them away and raise them as a state. They will not be raised by private families. That's what he wanted in his republic. It wasn't a joke, which some people who like to excuse him think. It wasn't a joke at all. His idea of the perfect society was one where you remove all difference. And the private family, he argued, and he wasn't wrong, is a difference creating machine. Differences are created in families, like I said, rich, poor, smart, stupid, moral, immoral, honest, dishonest, hardworking, lazy, whatever. A lot of this comes out of your family environment. So if you allow different families, you're allowing different standards for everything. But that is the West. And that's what the belief the West grew up with was that no government. Governments come, governments go. States come, states go. But the family, the eternal triangle of the mother, father, child endures forever and outlasts every form of government. And so that's where you have to place your cards, is in the family itself. The guy who said that the kids belong to the government was way off base, and he didn't get reelected, by the way.
Yeah, very well said as usual. Uh, 1 second, let's take the question of Magic After Dark. Please go ahead. Magic After Dark.
Hello, sorry, I had to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Perfect. William, I just wanted to say that you're literally a blessing to humanity, and I feel cherished to be here and listen to you talk.
Mm.
But I just wanted to give my opinion on something, and then I'll ask you a quick question. But just touching on the truth. I think that the truth is the truth. It can't be changed. It's universal, and I think a lot of people believe that as well. But I also think that there's some truths that we are not meant to know, and then that in turn tests the strength of our belief and how far we're willing to go for something that we don't actually know to be true. We just believe that it's true. So that was just the thought that I had on that when I heard you speak earlier. But in terms of the double slit experiment, I know it's a bit off topic, but I heard you mention it earlier. A lot of people have theorized that the frequencies that the human body emit, whether that be from the brain or the heart, have an effect on the quantum field and emit information. And that is the reason why there's a difference in the wave, or a difference in the hole that the photon takes when there's somebody present and when somebody is not. But I just wanted to get
You-
your opinion on that.
You're talking about that two-slit experiment.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about what you just said. I'd like to know more. Maybe you can send me some information on it. I'm still
Oh,
quite
100%.
fascinated by all that. I don't think that photons are thinking, but we don't have any explanation for why they seem to anticipate the experimenter. By the way, there's a wonderful little book for those of you who are like me, who are not physicists, which will help to clear up some of this. It's a book called Schrodinger's Kittens. And the introduction to that book is just a great little introduction, talking about this kind of thing, the two-slit experiment, and about what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. Now, even Newton, of course, Newton, by the way, was an incredible fellow. And if you're interested in other books, there's a wonderful book about Newton. I don't know why I can't remember the name of the author of the book, but it come to me after the show. But the book is called Newton's Gift, and it's a wonderful book about Newton. And I raise it just now because there was a plague in London at the time. Newton was 23 years old, or 22, and the way he dealt with the plague was like everybody else in those days. He isolated himself. He social distanced himself. He went to his family farm for almost 3 years. And when he was there, he wrote his famous Principia, which at the time, and I think still is, regarded as one of the great monuments of the human intellect. And we say that Newton has been superseded by Einsteinian physics now, and to some extent at tiny dimensions and at great speeds, that is true. But for everyday life, it's still all about Newtonian physics. I mean, 23 years old, he does this. I mean, quite amazing. Anyway, one of the things the fellow talks about in the Schrodinger's Kittens introduction is something that bothered Einstein, which was what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. I'll give you just one example. It so happens that sometimes quantum particles all have a spin. They spin left or they spin right naturally. So, and when you put two of them in association, particle A and particle B, you spin one to the left and you spin the other one to the right. A fellow named Alain Aspect, who was a French physicist, was fascinated by the fact that if he moved them apart a foot or two and he spun one to the right, the other one would spin to the left. So they weren't moving, but he made them go like this. One would make the other spin. How, he wasn't sure, because there was no communication between them. There's nothing passing between them that he could measure. So he took them 5 or 6 or 7 kilometers apart across Paris. And he worked out his experiment so that the machine would tell him what happened if he spun particle A, what would happen to particle B 7 kilometers away. and there was instantaneous action, not reaction, which is, A happens and it makes B happen. Instant reaction. You spin A, B spins the other way at exactly the same time, exactly the same moment. In other words, no time passed between the action of A and the action of B, which I say you can't call it a reaction because it wasn't reacting to anything that we could measure. That's fascinating. Spooky action at a distance is fascinating. And of course, so is gravity. In the book on Newton, you'll see a description of gravity to the effect that we don't know what it is. When I was in university, I had a physics friend. He was a brilliant guy. He never went to class. He'd just read the textbooks, and he got the highest marks in the university all the time. Just reading the studies. But he held a knife or a fork above the dinner table one time like this. And he said, Bill, he said, in here, meaning between his hand and the table, he said, there's something in there. And he dropped the fork. And of course, the fork would drop on the table. Something was pulling it. He said, but we don't know what it is. And I piped up. I said, well, it's the force of gravity. He said, well, you can call it what you want. You can call it Peter Rabbit if you want. And we know the formula because Newton worked it out. And the formula works every time. But we don't know what it is in itself. Like, what is this thing in here underneath my hand? And so he introduced me to some of the mysteries of physics as a young student. And I've been fascinated ever since. Anyway, I didn't answer much of your question because I'm not sure I understood it.
No, that's
Thank you,
fine.
William.
I literally just wanted to get your opinion on it. But sorry, just to add one more thing. I'm not sure what the title was, but you said the spooky theory. You just
Spooky
about
action at a distance. Yeah.
spooky actually at a distance. So that seems to fall into the category of that everything, including humans, are connected by the quantum field. So there was another experiment carried out where scientists removed like a strand of DNA from a living subject. They carried the DNA 50 miles away and then started to induce certain emotion like fear, happiness within the human subject, and it had a direct split-second effect on the strand of DNA which was 50 miles away. And I don't know if that falls into the same category, but it's kind of like everything is connected by the quantum field, and the human heart, they've proven that the human heart emits an electromagnetic field up to 8 feet. And it's all of this stuff is starting to be proven. So a lot of it was like spiritual beliefs back in the day, but it's starting to be proven by quantum physicists now, which is just mind-blowing to me. But I will send you some resources, and thank you for
thank
taking
you.
the time.
I'd like to see them. It's funny you mentioned the spiritual resources because in my book you'll see a couple of surveys which were done of modern physicists, and I would say half of them will tell you they believe in God or some kind of spiritual command of the universe, whereas in the 19th century it was always the biologists who said that, and the physicists before the quantum era, no, it's just mechanical, it's just force and action and reaction and first and second law, blah, 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 that kind of thing. Now you tend to find there's a lot of modern physicists who will tell you, I don't know what it is or how, but I think there's some kind of spiritual force out there. Call them God, call them whatever you want. But I'm no longer an atheist. That's what they'll say. Probably half of them. Whereas the biologists, with their Darwinian thing, and we haven't got into Darwin on this show, that's a whole different topic, which I find quite interesting too. The biologists tend to be the atheists, people like Richard Dawkins and all that, who will sing the atheist song all day long, even though if you really press them on the proofs of Darwinism, they will stumble or make excuses or tell you they need a little more time or something like that.
We have to make a show on Darwin as well, if you will be up to it. Can we take one last question? Actually, from me.
Please.
Yeah. So I sometimes feel like we are in some kind of battlefield of philosophical debate. So, in terms of like having ammunition, can you give us a few strong arguments that you can use against a relativist skeptic to demonstrate objective and universal truth?
Well, yeah, they're all in my book of absolutes. I mean, in every chapter, there are arguments which demonstrate objective reality. I don't know how much more clear to make it today because we're going to run out of time. The 400-page book talks. The only reason I wrote the book is to try to show that there are absolutes and universals which are not only here, but have always been here. And I think anybody who reads it will come out of the chapter on human universals agreeing that it's true. They'll come out of the chapter on physics, I think, very impressed with the number of, I call them constants of nature, that are in the physics chapter. And same with the chapter on biology, a tremendous number of constants of human and organic biology by which we are surrounded. And then near the end of the book, I have chapters on language in which we find the same thing. Universals of human language, which are true now, and I'd say likely have always been true as long as humans have existed.
Yes. Okay. William, we should continue with this amazing book of yours next Wednesday, if that's okay with you.
Okay, sure.
That's lovely. And then we go back to the war on the family. I would like to tell everyone that this coming Monday, we are going to have a very interesting event called Islam on Trial. It's going to be a very serious presentation with a lot of evidence and reference from the Muslim scholars. And it's going to be demonstrated how problematic Islam can be. So you guys are welcome to join. And we will have William Gairdner again next Wednesday to continue to discuss his book of absolutes. And then we are going to continue with the war on the family. Okay, William?
Thank you very much. You're very kind to put up with me.
No, your information and knowledge is incredible, and we appreciate that very, very much. It's very important to all of us. Thank you so much for your time and kindness and information.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, have a beautiful day. I will send you the recording as soon as I can, and I'm going to open the floor for free discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
William, I'm